Good morning, everyone. We start our work at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and the first event for today is a presentation of the 19th UN report on human rights situation in Ukraine. Now I give the floor to Ms. Fiona Frazer, head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. Ms. Fiona, the floor is yours.
Good morning to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the launch of the 19th quarterly report of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, covering the period of the 16th of May to the 15th of August 2017. We base our findings on data collected by our field teams located on both sides of the contact line, who conduct in-depth interviews, site visits and trial monitoring. We assist the government in improving the human rights situation and engage with the government representatives, civil society and any other interlocutors relevant for the protection of human rights. During these months, the people of Ukraine endured their fourth summer of armed hostilities. Those living in the conflict zone in the east face daily risks, hardships, and loss. They lost loved ones, they lost homes, they lost livelihoods. They suffered physically and psychologically from the constant threat. They were restricted in their movements. Their summer season, which should have been defined by vacations, beaches, and happy memories, was instead filled with shells, checkpoints, and destruction. Between the 16th of May and the 15th of August 2017, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission recorded 161 conflict-related civilian casualties. This included 26 civilians killed and 135 injured. This is a 17% decrease compared with the previous 3 months. While the first half of 2017 had seen a steady, high number of monthly casualties as compared with the previous year, there was a decrease in June by 14.5% and a further larger decrease in July by an additional 24.6%. In addition, there was no surge in the number of civilian casualties during the month of August, as had been feared based on previous years of the conflict. OHCHR recorded 41 conflict-related civilian casualties during August. By comparison, this is less than half the number recorded in August 2016. These lower numbers may be partially attributable to the harvest ceasefire, which commenced on the 24th of June upon the initiative of local community leaders on both sides of the contact line. It demonstrates that the parties can adhere to the ceasefire, and that when it is respected, a ceasefire makes a significant difference for lives and security of civilians. The parties have now embarked on another renewed ceasefire commitment as of the 25th of August in recognition of the start of the new school year. We call on the parties to the conflict to strictly adhere to this ceasefire and to implement their commitments in the Minsk agreements, including by withdrawing heavy weapons from the contact line. We also call on the parties to engage in meaningful mine action, including mine risk awareness activities, as many agricultural land plots remain contaminated with landmines and other explosive devices, endangering both residents and humanitarian workers on the ground. Despite the lower number of civilian casualties, the security situation during the reporting period remained volatile and unpredictable as hostilities persisted. Relatively calm periods were often interceded by abrupt increases and equally sudden drops in the number of ceasefire violations. The parties to the conflict also continued to place the civilian population at risk by positioning fighters and weapons in residential areas and by firing weapons from such areas. These actions likely invited return fire. For example, OHCHR noted increased shelling of Kamyanka after the return of the military presence to the village. Where such presence is justified due to military necessity, the parties to the conflict must protect the resident civilian population. Adequate alternative accommodation must be made available, as well as compensation for the use of property and any damages. Critical civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, also continue to be hit by shelling. On the 28th of May, the Central Hospital in Krasnohorivka sustained a direct hit to its main building, despite the fact that its roof was marked with a 4-meter large red cross. Water infrastructure was also significantly affected by shelling during this reporting period. Despite the agreement in Minsk to create safety zones around the Donetsk filtration station and the first lift pumping station, these facilities continued to come under shelling and small arms fire. The situation was sometimes exacerbated by the parties' failure to agree on windows of silence, which would allow vital repairs to be made to infrastructure damaged by shelling. We note that repairs were finally completed on the water pipeline running between Toretsk and Horlivka through no man's land, which was damaged by shelling in January. However, we also note that the negotiations for a window of silence to allow these repairs to be made dragged on for 7 months, while the affected population received either no or very limited water supply through a hot summer. It is imperative that the parties to the conflict respect the safety zones and that they agree upon and implement windows of silence in a timely manner to allow both for required repairs and regular maintenance of critical civilian infrastructure. We continue to document cases of arbitrary detention and the use of torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence in conflict-related cases on both sides of the contact line. We found cases where members of the Ukrainian armed forces apprehended individuals in relation to the conflict and held them incommunicado for approximately 24 hours before transferring them to an official detention facility. We also continue to document allegations of torture and ill treatment used by the SBU to extract confessions from conflict-related detainees. We have been informed, however, that the Military Prosecutor's Office has launched investigations into a number of these allegations. We were greatly hindered in our work in territory controlled by the armed groups by the denial of access to detainees and places of deprivation of liberty. We reiterate the need for independent international observers to be given access to conduct confidential interviews of detainees in line with international standards. This denial of access, coupled with worrisome first-hand information we have received, raises serious concerns regarding the conditions of detention and the treatment of persons held by armed groups. Granting unimpeded access to international observers including OHCHR, to meet with detainees in confidence would go some way to alleviate the belief that ill treatment and torture may be occurring. In the cases which we were able to document in territory controlled by armed groups, we found that persons were being held incommunicado, sometimes placed in solitary confinement for weeks. During this time, requests for information made by families of the victims were often met with blanket denials, a practice which amounts to enforced disappearance. It also further increases the suffering caused to families by prolonging the uncertainty of the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones. We remind all parties that the prohibition of enforced disappearance is absolute under international human rights law. Since April 2017, there have been no transfers to government-controlled territory of pre-conflict detainees held in armed group-controlled territory. This is despite their persistent requests. OHCHR encourages the parties to restart the transfers to enable reconnection with families. Accountability for human rights violations is a key element of the right to an effective remedy, an imperative to put an end to the atmosphere of impunity surrounding grave human rights violations committed in connection to the conflict. More than 3 years after the violent killings perpetrated during the Maidan protests in Kiev and on the 2nd of May 2014 violence in Odessa, little progress has been achieved in bringing the perpetrators to account. While investigations and legal proceedings are plagued with delays, suspects who fled the country continue to evade justice. On a positive note, prosecutions that are brought against members of armed groups have begun to address the specific human rights violations perpetrators. For example, unlawful detention, torture and ill treatment. This is rather than relying on more general charges related to terrorism. Meanwhile, we have entered the 4th year where close to 3 million people living in territory controlled by armed groups continue to face the risk of being detained and so-called charged in an arbitrary manner with no effective guarantees or safeguards. A record number of crossings of the contact line were recorded, over 1 million each month in May, June and July. This trend continued into August, when almost 1.2 million crossings were recorded. Despite extended summer operational hours at all entry-exit checkpoints, the huge volume of people crossing the contact line resulted, unsurprisingly, in long queues at the checkpoints. People waited in line for hours, exposed to extreme summer temperatures, degrading physical conditions, and inadequate sanitary facilities. The conditions were particularly challenging for the elderly, persons with disabilities, pregnant women, and children, exactly those groups who represent the largest percentage of persons crossing the contact line. In addition, all civilians queuing at the contact line are at risk from shelling and the presence of mines and explosive remnants of war. During the reporting period, at least 8 incidents of shelling near entry-exit checkpoints during operational hours were reported. In addition, at least 2 people were killed and another 1 injured by explosive devices located near the entry-exit checkpoints. I would also like to highlight the conditions at the Stanitsa-Luhanska crossing route, the sole crossing route available in Luhansk region, accessible only by foot. The deteriorating physical condition of the structure is particularly alarming. Pedestrians must maneuver across unsafe, wooden ramps haphazardly connecting the remnants of the destroyed bridge. There is a real risk that someone may be seriously injured or worse, especially as winter approaches, when snow and ice will further exacerbate the conditions. Given these circumstances, you may question why so many people expose themselves to these risks. People have no choice but to endure these tribulations, as they need to cross this artificial boundary in order to reunite with family members and friends, to receive medical treatment, to access essential social benefits, banking and legal services, and to shop for basic needs. OHCHR calls on the parties to ease impediments for the free movement of civilians across the contact line. The Stanica Luhanska crossing must be made safe for civilians to walk across before the onset of winter, and the number of crossing routes should be increased, particularly in Luhansk region. These simple efforts would provide substantial relief, allowing for the family and community ties which existed long before the conflict to continue bonding the Ukrainian people. OHCHR noted both positive and negative developments in regard to the freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly in Ukraine. While there were improvements, such as a decrease in judicial prohibitions of public assemblies, to policing of large public assemblies, there were also worrisome trends noted with regard to smaller assemblies. In particular, events organized in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa, which supported LGBT rights, were either violently disrupted or completely prevented from being held by members of the right sector, Svoboda, and other radical nationalistic groups. On these occasions, the police were either not present or were unable to provide adequate protection for the participants of the event. Furthermore, there appears to be a reluctance to take proper investigative actions and to appropriately classify charges against violent perpetrators in the investigation into his death. At the same time, foreign journalists are increasingly facing expulsion from Ukraine for allegedly engaging in so-called anti-Ukrainian propaganda. In territory controlled by armed groups, citizens openly expressing pro-Ukrainian views continue to experience intimidation or were at physical risk. A well-known blogger writing about life in armed group-controlled territory was detained incommunicado in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic since the beginning of June. He remains in detention, and his whereabouts are known now. Similarly, a woman who criticized the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic on social media was detained by armed groups and held incommunicado for 16 days in July. She has since been released. The socio-economic situation in eastern Ukraine continued to deteriorate. Hardships caused by the armed hostilities, measures hindering economic prosperity, and rising unemployment have led to the reported increase in levels of poverty on both sides of the contact line. Against this backdrop, two key government actions could significantly alleviate some of the hardship faced by the affected population. First, current obstacles on the equal enjoyment of socio-economic rights should be improved. In this regard, OHCHR strongly supports ongoing healthcare reform, as well as recent legislative initiatives that would allow for equal access to healthcare and pensions for all Ukrainians, including IDPs. Second, restitution of or compensation for property which has been damaged or destroyed due to the conflict is one of the most pressing and unaddressed socio-economic issues. We call on the government to develop the procedures necessary for an inventory and assessment of damaged and destroyed property located on either side of the contact line. I would like to stress that the key to a lasting future peace and reconciliation is in ensuring that all government policies are inclusive and non-discriminatory. We continue to document violence and discrimination against the Roma community, in some cases involving local authorities. In May, a group of men led by a member of the Kharkiv Regional Council and the head of the Vilshani Village Council attacked members of the Roma community in Vilshani, killing one person and injuring 3 others. In July, a Roma camp was set on fire following rhetoric from a member of the Lviv City Council calling for the eviction of Roma from Lviv. We are concerned about a lack of accountability for these crimes, as well as for the ones previously reported in Kiev in April 2017 and Loshivina and Shinivka in August 2016. OHCHR continued to seek access to Crimea in order to fulfill our mandate to monitor, document, and report on the human rights situation throughout Ukraine. We recall UN General Assembly Resolution 68262 on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as General Assembly Resolution 71205, which recognized Crimea as under the temporary occupation of the Russian Federation. During the reporting period, we recorded serious infringements on freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and religion or belief. The first criminal sanction for a social media post was handed down when a Crimean Tatar was sentenced to 1 year and 3 months for his Facebook post, which criticized the annexation and occupation of the peninsula. In face of restrictions prohibiting most public gatherings of organizations considered to be in opposition of the Russian Federation, several individuals chose to stage one-person pickets in a show of support for Crimean Tatars facing persecution. This resulted in the arrest and detention of at least 6 mostly elderly protesters. Yesterday, the Crimean Supreme Court sentenced Akhtiam Chinguz, a deputy chair of the Crimean Tatars Mejlis, to 8 years in a strict penal colony. We note that this eviction was handed down in relation to events which occurred on the 26th of February 2014, prior to the occupation of Crimea and the de facto implementation of Russian Federation laws in Crimea. In addition, freedom of religion or belief has been curtailed, specifically with regard to Jehovah's Witnesses. On the 1st of June, all 22 congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses in Crimea were deregistered, denying an estimated 8,000 people the right to freely profess their religion. OHCHR also documented the deportation of Crimeans who did not have Russian citizenship in accordance with immigration rules of the Russian Federation. We stress that as the occupying power, the Russian Federation is applying these laws in violation of international law and in violation of General Assembly Resolution 68262. Later this month, we will publish a report on the human rights situation in Crimea, as we have been requested to do so by the UN General Assembly. OHCHR welcomes the continuing judicial reform, including the adoption of a law on the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. With this new law, vacant seats on the court may now be filled and the court can address its backlog of cases. The shortage of judges extends to other courts across the countries, as the resignation and dismissal of judges continue to occur at a higher rate than the selection and appointment of new ones. Ukraine is currently short of 1/3 of the judges needed to fully staff its courts. Finally, We are following developments regarding the concept note and draft law on restoring state sovereignty, which we understand should be registered with the Parliament soon. We welcome the President's statement that wide consultations will be sought prior to the law's adoption. Any proposed legislation should reaffirm Ukraine's commitment to human rights and the protection of its population across the whole of the country, including the Donbass. Legislation must be inclusive and not divisive, to maintain strong bonds between the people of Ukraine and foster an environment receptive to future peace and reconciliation. I would like to end with a quote from a civilian living in the Eastern conflict zone who said to us, "We only see political ambitions on both sides. They are dividing something, but they forgot that there are people here." Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Колеги, хто бажає поставити запитання, будь ласка, представляйтеся і адресуйте. Говоріть лише в мікрофон.
If you want to ask questions, please introduce yourself and...
Vitaly Sayenko. I will try to ask in English. You should not use interpreter. I got interested. I want to point out you today mentioned during your presentation that in the cases, investigation cases, according to Maidan protests and Odessa, there are little progress have been achieved. Do you get in touch with Ukrainian authorities and do they explain why there's lack of progress in this case? And also I have one more question to you, which not relates to today's topic, but maybe you have some comment on that. As you may heard, former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, was stripped from Ukrainian citizenship, and it creates some problems on Ukrainian-Polish border. Do you have any question in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much for both questions. With regards to first, the ongoing cases relating to the violence that took place in Maidan and also second of May violence in Odessa, we are in ongoing discussions with the relevant authorities here in both in Kiev and also obviously with regards to Odessa in Odessa itself. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission was deployed at the outset, invited by the government with the purpose of assisting the government on questions of accountability in relation to the violence that took place at Maidan. So we've been working since 2014 with the authorities. We are in ongoing discussions as to how we see proceedings, and then of course, yes, they do inform us of where they see the bottlenecks and the complexity of both cases. And also specifically with regard to the 2nd of May violence in Odessa, we are working to follow up on a specific request that has been made to us and other international actors in trying to assist with the provision of forensic expertise. So in this way, we're trying to highlight to the authorities where we see the gaps, but also trying to assist with other international partners to ensure that there is the provision of justice for victims and also that perpetrators are brought to account. With regard to your second question, regarding Mr. Saakashvili, we, as part of the UN system, are aware of this case, and other actual UN agencies are particularly following up on the details.
Наступне запитання, будь ласка.
Next question, please. Nadia Yurchenko, Ukrinform. The question is, what do you think if this presentation, if this report is unbiased and impartial? Because you say that one, two, English channel, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Nadia Yurchenko, Ukrinform. Based on this report, someone may have the false impression that, well, one of the parties allows you to come to detention facilities and you can conduct your monitoring, the other one does not. You invite the both parties to allow access to places of deprivation of liberty, to detainees. The party that you refer to as armed groups, well, do you actually inform them about your observations, and do you continue insisting on having access there? Because it is a bit distorted picture, because one of the parties allows you, the other one does not, but you call on the both parties. Well, somehow, me personally, I feel that it is not quite fair based on this, the picture that is created by this report.
Thank you. You'll see in the report that we have reflected the situation with regards to access of places of deprivation of liberty on both sides or on either side of the contact line. We make reference to the fact that we do have access to detainees who are held on this side of the contact line by the authorities of the government, by the law enforcement agencies here. So that's, we clearly make reference to that. And when we are able to have access, we do enjoy confidential interviews with detainees in line with international standards. What we are saying, and we talk to regularly the representatives of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the representatives of the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic on the issue of allowing ourselves as international observers to access detainees and to do this in line with international standards, which means, most importantly, to be able to have confidential discussions, interviews with the detainees of our choice.
Good morning, Alexei Gavrilenko. You mentioned a blogger who was detained in the uncontrolled territory. While here in Zhytomyr in summer, they detained the blogger and the journalist Vasyl Morawiecki. Do you monitor that case, as well as the situation where the ombudsperson's representative announced that that was not the only case? There are about a dozen journalists detained all over Ukraine, and now they are in pre-trial facilities, pre-detention facilities. But in particular, this situation, this case of Vasyl Morawiecki in Zhytomyr, could you comment on that, and do you follow that?
Thank you very much for highlighting that specific case. Yes, we are aware of the case, and we're aware of a number of cases throughout Ukraine. Obviously, we can't highlight every single case that we follow. This is for different reasons. One of them, actually, also to highlight to you all today, is that we do have many cases that come to us, but for reasons of confidentiality and our whole methodology of the UN Human Rights Office, we can only publicly refer to a few of them. And obviously, in the short space of time here today, we can't go through all the individual cases. I did say at the outset that there have been positive and negative developments with regard to both freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. And so I think you need to also consider this as how we see the positive and negative developments, specifically with regard to freedom of expression and the ability of journalists and the media to work throughout Ukraine. But thank you very much for highlighting that specific case. And if you would like to discuss it in more detail, we're happy to do so. Thank you.
Будь ласка, наступне запитання. На жаль, це вже...
Next question, please, and this is the last one on air. Yuria Khovanskaya, Novosti Donbassa, News of Donbass, speaking about detention of bloggers and journalists in uncontrolled territories. In your report, you speak about detention of Vasin, and maybe you know something, some details about what's happening to that person now. Maybe you know something about Edward Nedelyaev, because if I'm not mistaken, he is sentenced now, and maybe he's already serving his term. Maybe you have some details or you see some progress for those cases.
I would just make the comment that, as I've just already made, that on individual cases, we say as much as we can say publicly, that, and you will find this in the report, but again, due to the way that we work, the way that we conduct our activities, that is individual interviews with victims, witnesses of both international human rights law, and also where there have been violations of international humanitarian law, we're not always able to publicly comment because there is this issue of confidentiality. But if you have a specific question on an individual case, then we're very happy to discuss it potentially with you in more detail, and if we're able to, we will share more information. Thank you.
Спасибо. Дякую всім. Зараз
Thank you all. Now a short comment from a representative of the UN mission. Dear colleagues, I am Irina. I am speaking about 2nd May case. We are now working to submit the request to the prosecutor's office regarding the possibility to provide forensic experts so this is not yet being done, and we are only working in the process of negotiations with the prosecutor's office. Thank you, Ms. Fiona. Thanks to everyone who has been here at the press briefing with us today, and we need to wrap up. If you still have further questions to UN mission representatives, you can do that off record.